You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with journalist and author Rachel Shabi and acting deputy political editor of the Mail on Sunday, Claire Ellicott. So let us see what is on some of those front pages for you now. A retired British Army officer says the UK's armed forces need a £3 billion yearly boost in order to replenish the weapons and tanks given to Ukraine and maintain a fighting ability. That's according to the Sunday Express. The Times goes with Iran International TV having to stop broadcasting from its London headquarters after the independent broadcaster says its staff have received threats from Tehran. The Telegraph reports that Boris Johnson is warning Rishi Sunak that overhauling Northern Ireland's post-Brexit arrangements would be a great mistake. Mr Johnson's fight to keep the Northern Ireland Protocol is also on the front of The Observer. The Mail on Sunday claims Prince Andrew fears he'll lose his £30 million Windsor home if his brother, King Charles, slashes his annual grant. The Mirror leads with Katie Price hitting out at the Metropolitan Police as officers are accused of mocking her disabled son in a WhatsApp group. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Claire Ellicott. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Observer and their front page story. The headline, Johnson threatens Sunak's bid to end deadlock over Brexit. The former Prime Minister making an intervention. Rachel.
Yes, another intervention from former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's a bit of a bad loser, isn't he? And it does seem to be hanging around Rishi Sunak's premiership like a bad smell. Sunak has been engaged in talks over the Northern Ireland Protocol, and they seem to be coming along quite well. I mean, all of the sides are saying pretty much the same thing, which in itself is a good sign. And they're saying that there's still a long way to go, but things are looking good in reaching a resolution over that Northern Ireland agreement. But Boris Johnson has turned up to say, well, this is very bad because it potentially will ditch the legislation that he put in, which allows the UK government to rip up Brexit arrangements unilaterally. Now, obviously, that in itself, being that legislation to unilaterally rip up agreements with the EU is not great. Sunak is saying, well, we won't need it if we reach this protocol. We won't need it. But it's interesting that, you know, Johnson is basically sniffing blood, isn't he? He's seen this opportunity. He's seen, you know, backbencher rebels within the Conservatives who aren't happy with Sunak over this potential deal and seems to want to make some sort of political capital out of it to the detriment of the Prime Minister.
Claire, yes, the paper's saying a source close to Johnson said it was his view that it would be a great mistake to drop the Northern Ireland Protocol bill.
This was introduced under his premiership, and I think we've all been wondering when the former Prime Minister was going to make his intervention. So Rishi Sunak has been negotiating with EU leaders. He flew to Belfast yesterday to speak to all of the unionist parties there, like the DUP, to try to get them on side. There have been positive noises coming from the EU, from the European Commission, from the DUP and from other Irish unionist parties. But the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has now made his intervention. He's warning that it would be a great mistake to drop the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament, but is sort of paused. It's not progressing. And it's essentially seen as leverage, really. It's a way of Rishi Sunak saying, well, if we don't come to an agreement on this, then we can use this nuclear option of overriding parts of the agreement, which was put in place by Boris Johnson, actually, when he agreed the withdrawal deal with Brussels. So it's all highly contentious. We're at a really crucial point. We think a deal is imminent. It's going to be days. We think Rishi Sunak might be speaking to his backbenchers tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow, trying to get them on side. So it'll be really unhelpful for Rishi Sunak. Boris is come in at this point to say what he has to say. But at the same time, the issues that Boris Johnson is is pointing to is that this agreement, we haven't seen the details yet, we don't really know what it is. If it contains some sort of way of the EU moderating, the ECJ is the key point of contention. If the deal allows the EU to do this, then there are going to be some implications for Northern Ireland, which unionist parties there really aren't happy with.
Yes, it's interesting, Rachel, that Sir Keir Starmer's told The Observer that he'll be taking the extraordinary step of offering Labour support in any parliamentary vote on the agreement.
Yes, that's right. So he's basically is taking the high ground in a way. He said, it should be country first, party second, and therefore, in the interests of the country, let's do what it takes to wave this bill through. And he said to Sunak that he doesn't want the Prime Minister to worry about, quote, appeasing an intransigent rump of his own backbenchers. And therefore, this assured him that he doesn't need to worry about that because he'll help him get the deal through. It's interesting, there's like two tracks of politics here for Sunak. There's, of course, the internal stuff with his own party. And this has always been, every Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister since Brexit happened has grappled with, the extreme wing of its party over Brexit. So he's got that internal political calculation. But internationally, the calculation, he seems to be doing all right. I mean, the EU is saying, actually, it's a bit of a relief to have someone who's a serious negotiator and not just posturing and doing things in name only. He's managed to get, quite disparate elements in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, on board with this. And of course, that's really important, not just in terms of getting this Brexit protocol sorted in terms of trade and business, but of course would unblock Stormont, the government, which is currently paralysed because the DUP won't take part in it over this precise issue. So, and the US as well. Another factor, the US is sort of quietly supportive of Sunak trying to resolve this very knotty issue. So internationally, it has to be said that Sunak appears to be doing quite well. Internally, with his own party, not so much.
Well, factoring in the DUP, as you mentioned, they've urged the Prime Minister, Mr Sunak, to stand by the protocol rather than cave in to Brussels, which says the bill flouts international law. And just reported here that Markus Šefčovič, the Vice President of the European Commission, is already boasting about the role of the ECJ being protected, and that therein lies the bone of contention. Claire.
Yes, I mean, it is the main problem. You have EU oversight of a part of the UK. It's a highly complicated issue, but it was always the real central problem of Brexit. How do you have Northern Ireland, which borders Ireland, which is still part of the EU, how do you trade across those two territories without there being a land border, which would infringe the Good Friday Agreement? It's the intractable issue of Brexit. It's been a problem ever since everyone started talking about Brexit after the referendum result. And it's going to be really, really hard to resolve. There's some suggestion that Rishi Sunak has proposed a sort of mechanism that would involve Belfast having to refer the Assembly having to refer any sort of trade dispute to the ECJ, which would give them a sort of middleman role, so it wouldn't be ultimately that the ECJ are in charge. But it's very hard. It's one of the EU's red lines that they will not back down, that the ECJ have some sort of rule, have some sort of power over this. But that is not going to be acceptable to many people like Boris Johnson and many of the Eurosceptics that Rishi Sunak will have to manage if he wants to get some sort of deal agreed.
Staying with Rishi Sunak, but moving on to the economy, the front page of The Telegraph reporting that the Prime Minister is facing a major budget rebellion over his corporation tax hike. Rachel.
Yeah, so this is another thing that's going on in his own party and the internal party dynamics. He's got a flagship policy, actually, to raise corporation tax from 19 to 25%. It's worth remembering that, 25% was where it was at before Cameron in 2010. Slashed it down to 19%, and 25% would bring it back in line with, most European countries, and obviously would bring a lot of money into the public purse at a time when, we're looking at pay disputes across the public sector. So it's an important one. But again, he's got a rump of sort of free market fundamentalists, I guess, in his party, who are very sort of slash and burn, who believe that low tax is the answer to everything, as opposed to something which is becoming much more acceptable across Europe and certainly in the US, which is, look, you're going to have to tax the rich or the richest in order to rebalance an economy that, for quite a long time now has favoured the wealthiest at the expense of the poorest.
And Claire, we read that a letter to Mr Sunak signed by the leaders of several influential groups of Tory MPs is urging him to follow a growth agenda and adopt a fresh approach to encourage investment.
And this is fascinating because it sort of speaks to how ungovernable sometimes the Tory party can be. And we've seen in the aftermath of Liz Truss, obviously she wanted growth, she wanted low taxes, she wanted to attract business to the UK. And we saw how that went, her plans backfired and the market crashed. You've still got a lot of people in the party who are like, we need to go for growth. We can't, consign ourselves to sort of manage decline. We need to be attracting businesses to the UK. And by putting up corporation tax, you have the exact opposite effect by driving businesses away. And we have seen some really big pharmaceutical companies saying that because of these plans Rishi Sunak has announced to increase corporation tax 25%, they will be moving to places that have far lower tax, like Dublin and other places around the world. And they're saying that the UK is not a great place to invest anymore because it's just too expensive to run businesses here. So it's a really careful balancing act that Rishi Sunak will have to manage his backbenchers who are really pro-growth, who think that Liz Truss may have she had the right medicine even if it didn't work out. He has to manage that together with keeping the UK as balancing the books, making sure that enough money is coming in to keep the economy going.
Rachel, take us to the Sunday Times and a story that we've been covering this evening. This is the story of an Iranian television channel based in London, I believe, having to close their headquarters on the advice of Scotland Yard because of threats to their staff. Yeah,
this is an incredible story. So it's a dissident Iranian TV channel, and it's been forced to stop broadcasting from its headquarters in Britain on advice from Scotland Yard, who have said, look, we cannot safeguard staff from Tehran-backed attacks, kidnaps, assassinations. This is incredible advice. This is a channel that has been operating in the UK for some time. A lot of its staff, I don't know how many, but certainly, a big chunk of them are British citizens. So we've got counter-terrorism police chiefs saying to British citizens, we cannot protect you on British soil from attacks from Tehran, which seems a staggering thing to say, but that is precisely the advice that staff at this channel have been given.
Yes, about 100 staff work at the headquarters, and many of them long-term British residents. But as you say, this exceptional advice from counter-terrorism police chiefs that they should relocate from London to Washington, DC. Claire, just very quickly, a few seconds on this.
It's just very shocking. Iran, the Director General of MI5 has sort of labelled Iran a rogue state. They've said they've had to foil a number of kidnappings and attempted murders by state actors in the UK. And we've seen, they put to death a British resident recently who used to work for the regime. They are clearly carrying out plots in the UK, and the fact that the police say they can't manage it is actually extraordinary. It's really genuinely worrying.
Yes, very shocking indeed. Claire and Rachel, for the moment, thank you. Coming up, we'll take a look at the front of the Observer, which carries this story: food banks at a breaking point as demand hits new highs. Stay with us for more on that and other stories. Welcome back. You are watching the Press Preview. Still with me, journalist and author Rachel Shabi and acting deputy political editor of The Mail on Sunday, Claire Ellicott. Welcome back to both of you. Let's have a look at The Observer to start with. And this story about food banks. More people are depending on them than ever before in Britain, according to new figures. And ever-increasing numbers of households, they're saying. Pensioners, NHS staff, teachers. Quite shocking story, really, Rachel.
It really is an appalling story. When you think about, the fact that, 10, 15 years ago, Britain didn't really have a food bank culture. It wasn't a thing. And now it very much is. And food banks, as The Observer is reporting, are at breaking point because of the increased usage. There's been new reports by the Independent Food Aid Network saying that almost 90% of the food banks surveyed reported an increased demand between December of last year and January of this year. And that if demand rose further, over half of those are saying they just won't be able to cope and will have to start turning people away. Of course, it's a chain reaction, isn't it? Because as more and more people are affected by spiraling costs and inflation, people are perhaps less able to donate to those food banks, and then those food banks are less able to help more and more people who need that kind of help in the eye of this crisis. So it is a fairly damning statement. And we were looking, before the break at the idea of raising corporation tax to 25%. This is why other countries do things like that. It's so that, we have a contract with society. We have a safety net beyond which people don't fall. And the way to do that, the only way to do that, is to tax the highest earners in society. That's how you manage to get redistribution. And that's how you avoid this horrible situation where these food banks are so desperate that they might now have to start turning people away.
Claire, and if food banks are at breaking point, that suggests that much, much worse is to come.
Well, yes, in some ways, but in some ways not. So things are really, really bad at the moment. They think, inflation for food is something like 16.7%. That's unimaginable a few years ago. But the key thing is that economists seem to think that inflation has peaked and that things will start to get better. Energy prices are incredibly bad at the moment, but they're likely to start to come down soon. And hopefully the cost of food, transport, and all of those things that are linked to energy will also start to come down. So there is some hope, but it's undeniable that things are incredibly hard for everyone at the moment. Mortgage prices have gone up, food prices have gone up. Everybody's finding it really hard to pay their energy bills. And it's really affecting some of the poorest in society who've been forced to turn to food banks. It's also affecting middle-class people who aren't usually used to worrying about these sorts of things. So it's been an incredibly difficult time for Britain and a lot of the Western world. And it will no doubt be really tough for some time yet. But the only sort of silver lining is that things should start to get a bit better sometime soon.
Rachel, just about 20 seconds on Prince Andrew worrying that he'll be forced out of his £30 million Windsor home.
I mean, world's tiniest violin to have this story following the one on food banks, right? He fears he'll lose his £30 million home. The King is looking at slashing his annual grant in light of, all those accusations of sexual assault, which, of course, Prince Andrew continues to deny.
Rachel and Claire, thank you so much. We'll see you in the next hour.